I think I might be a preterist now in regards to the book of Revelation in the Bible and biblical prophecy in general. And I think it's been a long time coming. The preterist view is a view that the events described in Revelation correspond to actual events that happened in the 1st century AD, mainly around the time of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD and the years immediately leading up to it. When I first got interested in biblical prophecy back in the early 2000s, I had a futurist view. That was a very popular view of biblical prophecy at the time, and still is with a lot of people now. It's a view that's been around a long time, centuries, I guess, but I think it became really popular back in the late 90s and early 2000s because of Tim LaHaye's fictional Left Behind novel series that has a futurist view of Revelation. I'm not going to go into a deep dive into any of these views on Revelation in this video, as this is more about my journey from a futurist to a historicist to now, I think, a preterist view, and why. If you want an overview of some different perspectives on Revelation in one book, I recommend the book titled 4 Views on the Book of Revelation. But just briefly here, the futurist view sees most of the events described in Revelation as events that have not happened yet, particularly the stuff from chapter 4 onwards. It particularly revolves around the rapture, which is a belief Jesus will return and gather all his believers with him and leaving the non-believers behind, which is how Tim LaHaye's book Left Behind got its name, because the book deals with the people that were left behind. It's a pre-tribulation view, with the tribulation being a time the non-believers have to go through where the Antichrist has come to power before Jesus returns again in judgment, and then a 1,000-year reign of peace. And for a long time I thought that, or at least something along those lines, was an accurate view of Revelation. But what changed as I started to learn more about history? It might have started the first time I heard that Emperor Nero's name adds up to 666. The ancients tended to associate numbers with letters in the alphabet, much like how we still do now with Roman numerals. The same was true for Greek letters and maybe even Hebrew letters. If I remember correctly, though, it's the Greek spelling of Nero's name that had letters that added up to 666. At first, I might have wondered, well, maybe that's just a coincidence. A lot of people have tried to figure out how adding up a name could equal 666 and accuse other people in history of having a name that adds up to that. I think one of the Latin titles of the Pope supposedly adds up to 666. I think back in the day, some people thought Ronald Reagan might be the Antichrist, because his first, middle, and last name each have 6 letters in it, which is a silly way to look at it in hindsight. And I'm not even sure how many people took that seriously back then. The number isn't 3 individual 6s, it's 666, which is what Nero's name adds up to. Eventually, I came around to the idea that maybe the Antichrist of Revelation actually is Nero, which, if so, kind of throws a wrench into the futurist view. But that, and the other big thing that drew me into the historicist view, is when I found out that the Romans built a temple to Jupiter in Jerusalem where the destroyed Jewish temple was. The Roman temple is long gone now, but in the 2nd century it was known as Jupiter Capitolinus, and it was built by Emperor Hadrian. Finding this out, I think that was really the kicker that drove me away from the futurist view to the historicist view. Which, to be clear, the historicist view is the view that Revelation contains prophecies of events that occurred soon after the book was written, and it also includes prophecies for events later in history and continues up to the present time, with some stuff still unfulfilled. But one of the beliefs in the futurist view, which doesn't just draw from Revelation, but also the book of Daniel and Jesus, Olivet Discourse in the Gospels, is that the Antichrist will build a new pagan temple in Jerusalem and set up an image of himself in it. The book of Daniel in particular is where futurists get their belief that the Antichrist will build a pagan temple and set up an idol of himself during a tribulation period. But Daniel's prophecy is a past event now. It refers to Antiochus Epiphanes, a Greek Seleucid king who treated Jews harshly and desecrated the Jewish temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar and then building a statue of Zeus at the temple, which is the abomination of desolation that Daniel is referring to in Daniel chapter 27. And I think if you know the history of the region, it's pretty clear Antiochus is who Daniel is talking about, and that his prophecy is now entirely a past event. It was already a past event by the time of Jesus and John, who wrote Revelation. So with that in mind, plus now finding out that the Romans also built a temple over the destroyed Jewish temple, it became clear to me that the futurist view of Revelation and biblical prophecy in general is inaccurate. So I started to shift into the historicist view that would encompass prophecies of events from the first century on up to the present and beyond. In a historicist view, there is still room for prophecies not yet fulfilled, but it eliminates the idea of a 7-year tribulation period with an antichrist building a new pagan temple in Jerusalem, because the prophecies are based on historical events. The Daniel prophecy refers to Antiochus Epiphanes, and the similar sounding event Jesus refers to in the Gospels. Using Daniel's prophecy as an example is the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and the Romans building a temple on the Temple Mount is similar to what happened before in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. But once you realize both Daniel and Jesus were talking about what are both past events now, the futurist view falls apart. So it was an easy shift towards the historicist view from that point for me. I could see that some of the stuff in Revelation, as well as Daniel and the Gospels, were past events. So at that point, it was on to figuring out what some of the other events were. And I found things in medieval times I thought might fit some of it, but perhaps more vaguely and never totally clear. More like, maybe this is what this verse was talking about type of thing. For example, I thought Revelation 17:9 through 11 might have been referring to the Roman Empire and the later Holy Roman Empire. Because in verse 11, the beast that once was but is not, and then being an 8th king but one of the original 7, in verses 9 and 10, to me sounded like the 8th king was the rise of the Holy Roman Empire, which claimed to be a part of the original Roman Empire, but had been gone for a few hundred years at that time, at least in the West anyway. And it kind of made sense to me, but then it kind of leaves open, who were the original 7 in particular? There were a lot more than 7 Roman emperors, and this is one of those aha moments for me, and now shifting towards preterism. The first 5 of the 7 would be the first 5 Roman emperors. It starts with the emperor who was reigning when Jesus was born, which was Augustus, who also just so happens to be the very first Roman emperor, followed by Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. After Nero, there was a turbulent period known as the Year of the 4 Emperors, because 4 different men held the title the same year, so that might explain the one who came next that reigned briefly, and the prophecy might just skip over the next 2 for Vespasian to be the 7th. But it's a lot more than just that. The overall narrative of Revelation in general just makes more sense to me now. What John is telling the people of the first century is what to expect to happen next, which he says is happening very soon. I mean, that's literally the first verse of the book. John says these things are to happen very soon. So when you take that into consideration, you just have to look at the events happening in the first century, in the mid to late first century. Now, some people think John wrote Revelation very late in the first century, but that isn't a universally accepted viewpoint. More likely he wrote in the 60s AD, and all, or at least most of the events he's talking about occur in the lead up to the destruction of the Jewish temple by the Romans in 70 AD. I'm not going to go into detail here, but the events like the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets can be associated with historic events in the first century AD if you know what to look for. The apocalyptic writing style uses hyperbole and symbolic imagery, so it's not always obvious what is being referred to unless you know where in time to look for the event and how the hyperbolic or symbolic language would refer to that event. Then really the overall narrative of the book of Revelation has to do with God essentially divorcing himself from the Jews who rejected Jesus and then marrying his new church, which are the Christians who included Jews who accepted Jesus, as well as Gentiles who accepted Jesus. This is what Revelation chapters 17 through 19 is about. The whore of Babylon being Jews who rejected Jesus, and Babylon being a name to symbolically refer to Jerusalem in this case, because it had become like Babylon. It's usually thought Babylon is referring to Rome in this context, but Rome isn't the city that is destroyed. The whore is riding on a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, which is Rome, and Jerusalem is a vassal of the Roman Empire, hence why Jerusalem, called Babylon in this prophecy, is riding on the beast, which is Rome. And historically, Jerusalem is the city that was destroyed at that time in history. So in the preterist view, God has divorced himself from having one holy city by allowing it to be destroyed, and married himself to the new church, which will spread everywhere and not be limited to worship in one city. And that's just a very brief summary of the preterist view. I'm not going to do a deep dive, and I wouldn't even say I've done a deep dive into it myself. I'm still learning this. I haven't learned all about it yet, but I'm already finding it to be very compelling. I just started reading about this view recently, but it already seems so much clearer to me than any other view. The futurist view has long been old news to me, as it was obvious to me that at least some of the events the futurists think are still in the future are already past events. The historicist view seemed more likely to me for a long time, but at the same time, matching Revelation events to historical events was a bit more vague, and so it wasn't always all that clear. It seemed more foggy. But I gotta say, looking at this preterist view, it's been more clear to me, not as foggy as the historicist view. Now, I don't know if I'm 100% converted to the preterist view yet, but I'm definitely at least on the fence between preterist and historicist and leaning towards the preterist side, and I think that's the direction I'm going in now. Now, I think I'll bring all of this up, and if you're still listening at this point, thanks for still being here. But I think the reason I felt like putting my journey from futurist to preterist out there is because of why it took me so long to get here, and maybe if anyone else has put off learning about the preterist view, maybe my journey to this point could be helpful to them. But I think I never gave the preterist view the time of day because I used to think, how could that possibly be an accurate view? I mean, how could all the events prophesied in the Bible, short of the second coming of Christ, already be long past events? What is even the point of the last 2,000 years or so? If the prophecies occurred so long ago, what is God waiting for? And it's actually a verse from the book of 2 Peter that I think I can credit with being the catalyst for researching the preterist view. It's that verse, along with the events I already associated as first century events in prophecy, that led me to thinking, well, maybe all of those events could have occurred in the first and maybe second century at the latest. This verse is 2 Peter 3:9. The Lord is not slow concerning his promise, as some regard slowness, but it is being patient towards you, because he does not wish for any to perish, but for all to come to repentance. The reason that verse meant so much to me is because it made me realize what the last 2,000 years have been about. The events John and Jesus and Daniel said would happen all happened long ago, or at least most of it. Perhaps the only thing left to be fulfilled is the second coming of Christ. And with that verse from 2 Peter, I understand why it's taking so long, because God does not wish any to perish. So the second coming has been delayed, because God still hopes more will come to him, and still wants the gospel message spread to the entire world. And on the surface, it might seem like it's already been spread everywhere, but not entirely. There's still uncontacted tribes in the Amazon. There's still an uncontacted tribe on North Sentinel Island in the Indian Ocean. There's not many places the gospel hasn't been to at one point in time or another. There's still a few places, and perhaps that is what God is waiting for. I figure it must be one of 3 things, though. Either God is hoping everyone will come to him, which we might all be waiting a long time if that's the case, or he's waiting until things just get so bad that he finally gives in and comes and gets whoever he can and judges the rest. Well, that's kind of a pessimistic view. I think I better like the idea that he's just waiting for the gospel message to spread literally everywhere and give as many people the chance to accept him as possible. Because as Peter says, God is long-suffering and does not wish any to perish. So I think he wants to get as many as he can, which I feel is the more optimistic view. And I think it's the view we should have. This is why I actually am finding the preterist view much more freeing now. I don't feel the need to bother looking for signs and trying to match them with current events. People spend so much time looking for signs, like the mark of a beast being a microchip in the body, or the creation of the modern state of Israel back in 1948 having some significance. But now I realize these aren't really signs of anything specifically mentioned in the Bible. At this point in time, we're just kind of winging it here. And I think the futurist view is a somewhat negative view for the faithful to have, because I feel like not only does it make them spend time looking for specific signs of the second coming, which I now think are distracting from what is important, but it also has a tendency to make Christians complacent in the sense that they think the second coming is near, and then it's easier to just wait for Jesus to come and rescue them from evils of the world and judge it. But that isn't what Christians should be doing. God doesn't want any to perish, so from a Christian perspective, Christians should be trying to convert others to Christianity and not be complacent and just let God come and save the world for them. Christians should be trying to spread the message of salvation to the world themselves, not waiting for God to do it for them. And there is precedent in the Old Testament for our prophecy to be delayed. In Jeremiah 18, God says through Jeremiah that if at any time he declares he will destroy a nation, but that nation turns from its evil, he will relent. Alternatively, if he will bless a nation, but they do evil and don't listen to him, he will relent and not do the good he intended for them. Later in Jeremiah 26, we are told that after Micah prophesied destruction for Israel, it didn't happen because God relented after he saw the people of Israel repent. Sometime later, the Babylonians came and took the Jews into exile, but it was delayed from the time it would have happened had the people of Israel not repented when they did. This isn't the only example of such a thing happening. So a prophecy can be conditional, and the prophecy can be delayed, or I guess in theory, even averted if a certain condition is met. The Jews were able to stave off a prophecy of destruction for a while because they repented. If a prophecy back then can be delayed, a prophecy now can be delayed. I think the condition that has been delaying Jesus' return for so long is that his message hasn't been preached everywhere yet. And in some cases, in places it has been preached before, it might not have been preached abundantly enough to get everyone's attention there because of oppression or just a lack of interest. So with all that in mind, the preterist view works for me now. The past 2,000 years or so aren't a mystery. The events the Bible spoke of in prophecy are already long past. But God didn't forget about us after that. He still plans to return, but he has delayed his return because he wants to be able to save as many as he can. I long thought we were waiting on God, but now I realize it's God who is waiting on us. Those are my thoughts on that. Thanks for listening.